A wealthy and successful black CEO stops at a small-town café, seeking a moment of peace, but instead becomes the target of blatant racism from a local officer. Despite his calm demeanor and clear authority, he's harassed, humiliated, and treated as if his accomplishments mean nothing due to deep-seated racial bias. The officer's discriminatory actions escalate, exposing the systemic prejudice that still thrives in America. This gripping story highlights the infuriating reality of racism, the abuse of power, and the resilience it takes to confront injustice, leaving audiences questioning how such biases persist in modern society. Dr. Elijah Carter adjusted the frayed strap of his leather satchel as he stepped into the small-town diner. The bells on the door chimed softly, their cheerful jingle at odds with the glances that flickered his way. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and strangers were noticed immediately, especially strangers like him. Elijah glanced around, taking in the scuffed linoleum floors and the worn vinyl booths, their corners patched with duct tape. The air smelled faintly of coffee and bacon grease, tinged with a subtle undercurrent of cleaning solution. The waitress behind the counter barely looked up, her focus on a crossword puzzle spread across the counter. For a moment, Elijah considered walking out. He had passed dozens of diners on his drive into town, any of which might have been more welcoming. But this one was here, and he was hungry. Humility had taught him long ago not to assume the world would open doors for him, even when it should. He slid into the nearest booth, the seat creaking beneath his weight. It was then he noticed the stares, not outright hostile, but filled with quiet curiosity. His tailored shirt and polished shoes stood out against the casual flannel and denim of the other patrons. Elijah had driven into town from the city for a meeting at the courthouse, and though he hadn't planned on making a pit stop, a growling stomach left him no choice. His wristwatch glinted under the dim light, an understated timepiece worth more than most people's cars. Yet it never felt like a badge of pride to him, just a gift from his late father. A waitress finally approached, her pencil tucked behind her ear. "What'll you have?" she asked, her tone clipped but not unkind. Elijah scanned the menu and smiled. "I'll take the chicken and waffles, please, and coffee black." Her pencil hovered for a moment. She seemed to hesitate before jotting the order down, her eyes lingering on his face as though searching for a reason to question his presence. "Coming right up," she said, spinning on her heel. As she disappeared into the kitchen, Elijah reached into his bag and pulled out a stack of legal briefs. He thumbed through the papers, mentally rehearsing his upcoming testimony. He had been called in to provide expert insight into a high-profile civil case involving wrongful termination. The stakes were high, but Elijah wasn't one to shy away from pressure. Years as a neurosurgeon had prepared him for that. What unsettled him was the setting. A courthouse in a rural town where the community's unspoken rules often carried more weight than written law. It was a story he knew all too well. Elijah's phone buzzed, jolting him from his thoughts. It was a text from his assistant back in Atlanta. "Remember to keep it light. They'll underestimate you, but don't let it throw you off. You've got this." He smirked, appreciating the pep talk, even as the weight of her words lingered. A shadow fell across the table, and Elijah looked up to see two men standing nearby. They were dressed plainly, one in a faded trucker cap and another in a flannel shirt that strained over his broad shoulders. The taller of the two gestured at Elijah's papers. "Fancy work for a place like this," the man said, his tone half friendly, half skeptical. Elijah offered a polite smile. "Just catching up on some reading before an appointment." "Lawyer or something?" the other man asked, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Doctor," Elijah replied evenly, folding his hands over the documents. He was used to this curiosity that often bordered on disbelief, especially in places like this. It was as though his very presence disrupted the natural order of things. The taller man let out a low whistle. "A doctor? Huh, bet you don't get many folks like you around here." His words carried an undertone that made Elijah's jaw tighten, but he kept his expression neutral. "Not often," Elijah replied. He didn't elaborate. The men lingered a moment longer before retreating to their booth, their voices low, but unmistakably pointed. Elijah caught snippets of their conversation, the words, "city folk," and "showing off" drifting across the room. He sighed, turning his attention back to his papers. It wasn't the first time he'd felt like an uninvited guest in his own country, and it wouldn't be the last. The waitress returned with his coffee, setting it down with a clink. "Food'll be out in a few," she said, her tone softer than before. "Thank you," Elijah replied, offering her a brief smile. As she walked away, he noticed her glance toward the men's table, her brow furrowed slightly. He couldn't be sure if it was concern or annoyance, but it reminded him of the delicate balance people often had to maintain in places like this, where standing out could make you a target, and speaking up could make you a pariah. The minutes dragged on. Elijah couldn't help but notice the subtle shifts in the room. Conversations grew quieter when he looked up, and the occasional sideways glance felt sharper than before. He tried to focus on his papers, but the tension in the air was hard to ignore. When his food finally arrived, he thanked the waitress and began eating, savoring the warmth of the meal, despite the cold undercurrent in the diner. But just as he was starting to relax, the door jingled open, and a new figure entered. The man who stepped in was stocky and imposing, with a sheriff's badge gleaming on his chest. He scanned the room before his eyes landed on Elijah, narrowing slightly. The sheriff approached the counter, leaning in to speak with the waitress. Their conversation was brief, but Elijah didn't miss the way the sheriff's gaze flicked toward him multiple times. A few moments later, the sheriff walked over to Elijah's booth. "Afternoon," he said, his voice gruff but not overtly hostile. "Afternoon," Elijah replied, his tone measured. "Mind if I ask what brings you through town?" the sheriff asked, his arms crossed over his chest. Elijah set down his fork, maintaining eye contact. "I'm here on business. I have a meeting at the courthouse later today." The sheriff's eyebrows lifted slightly, but he didn't respond right away. Instead, his gaze dropped to the legal briefs on the table, then to Elijah's satchel, as though searching for something out of place. "We don't get many visitors," the sheriff finally said. "Especially not for court. You some kind of expert witness?" Elijah nodded. "That's right." The sheriff's expression remained unreadable, but the faint tension in his stance was hard to miss. "Well, enjoy your meal," he said, after a long pause, stepping back. "Just remember, we like things quiet around here." Elijah's eyes followed the sheriff as he returned to the counter. The words had been innocuous enough, but the undertone was clear. "Stay in line, don't stir the pot." As the sheriff struck up a conversation with the men in flannel and the trucker cap, Elijah's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a calendar notification for his meeting. He slipped his papers back into his bag and signaled for the check. The waitress approached with a cautious smile. "Hope everything was okay," she said, her voice quiet. "It was. Thank you," Elijah replied, sliding cash across the table. He glanced at her name tag, Samantha, and hesitated before speaking again. "You take care, Samantha." Her smile faltered, and for a moment, Elijah thought she might say something. But instead, she just nodded, quickly retreating to the counter. As Elijah stepped out into the midday sun, he felt the weight of unseen eyes following him. The air outside was fresh and crisp, a stark contrast to the stifling atmosphere of the diner. He adjusted his satchel and started toward the courthouse, his mind already turning to the task ahead. Whatever awaited him there, he was ready. Or so he thought. Elijah Carter's polished shoes echoed against the marbled floors of the courthouse lobby. The light streaming through the high, arched windows cast fractured beams onto the tile, but the brightness did little to warm the space. People milled about, clerks with their arms full of files, attorneys gesturing animatedly as they reviewed cases, and a security officer stationed by the metal detector near the entrance. Elijah paused to adjust his tie. The morning's events in the diner still lingered, a faint bitterness seeping into his usually steady demeanor. He reminded himself to focus. This was just another day, another courtroom, another fight for justice. He had faced worse, but as he approached the security checkpoint, he noticed the officer's posture shift, straightening, tightening. Elijah placed his bag on the conveyor belt, then stepped toward the scanner with the same calm, deliberate pace he used in the operating room. "Sir, step back," the officer barked, his voice carrying an edge of authority designed to cut through any protest. Elijah froze, momentarily thrown by the sharpness in the man's tone. "I'm sorry, did I do something wrong?" "Empty your pockets," the officer snapped, as though Elijah hadn't heard the basic instructions. His eyes scanned Elijah from head to toe, lingering on his tailored suit as if it were a disguise meant to obscure something criminal. "I already did," Elijah replied evenly, stepping back and raising his hand slightly to show compliance. He turned out his pockets, revealing a folded handkerchief and a set of car keys. The officer frowned, his eyes narrowing. "Step through the scanner again." Elijah obliged, moving slowly to avoid any sudden movements. He could feel the eyes of other visitors on him, the weight of their assumptions pressing into his back. The scanner beeped, and the officer immediately stepped forward, holding up a handheld wand. "Spread your arms," the officer ordered, his tone making it sound like a punishment. Elijah did as instructed, forcing his jaw to unclench. He told himself it wasn't worth the energy to argue, not here, not now. But as the wand hovered over his chest, then down his sides, a flicker of heat began to rise in him. "Sir, what exactly are you looking for?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. The officer didn't answer, continuing the search until he was satisfied. Or perhaps until he felt Elijah had been sufficiently humiliated. Finally, he waved Elijah through with a curt nod, his expression unchanged. "You're good to go." Elijah retrieved his bag from the conveyor belt, offering the man a tight smile. "Thanks," he said, the word clipped but polite. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing him rattled. As he walked away, he caught the faint sound of someone behind him muttering, "Probably thought he was some kind of big shot." The words weren't meant to carry, but they did, landing like small stones against his composure. Elijah took a deep breath, filing the moment away. It wasn't new. It wasn't surprising, but it still stung. The courtroom itself was a stark contrast to the lobby. Quiet, almost reverent rows of wooden benches faced the judge's bench, and the air carried the faint smell of varnish and paper. Elijah found his seat at the plaintiff's table, setting his briefcase down and pulling out his notes. The attorney representing the plaintiff, Meredith Daniels, gave him a small nod of acknowledgement. She was a sharp-eyed woman in her early 40s, her auburn hair pulled into a no-nonsense bun. "Dr. Carter, good to see you," she said, her tone brisk but polite. "Ready for today?" "Always," Elijah replied, offering a small smile. He glanced at the opposing table, where the defense team was gathering their own papers. The lead attorney, a man in a charcoal gray suit, barely spared him a glance. His client, a middle-aged corporate manager accused of racial discrimination in a high-profile firing, leaned over to whisper something. Whatever he said made the attorney smirk. Elijah turned his attention back to Meredith. "Anything I should know before we start?" "Just be yourself," she said. "They're going to try to undermine your credibility. Maybe make it about anything other than the facts. Stick to your expertise, and we'll be fine." Elijah nodded, but her words sparked a flicker of unease. He had been in enough courtrooms to know that credibility could be attacked in ways that were less about evidence and more about perception. As the proceedings began, the opposing attorney wasted no time in setting the tone. His cross-examination of the first witness, a former employee of the defendant, was pointed and relentless, aimed less at uncovering the truth and more at planting doubt. By the time Elijah was called to the stand, the room felt heavier, as though the weight of the case had settled into every corner. "Dr. Carter, thank you for being here today," the opposing attorney began, his tone saccharine enough to make Elijah's skin crawl. "You're quite accomplished, aren't you? A neurosurgeon, an author, and now, an expert witness?" "I like to think my work speaks for itself," Elijah replied, his voice steady. "Of course," the attorney said, pacing slightly as though addressing an invisible jury. "And yet, with all your achievements, you found time to testify in this case. Tell me, Dr. Carter, what drew you to this particular situation?" Elijah folded his hands in his lap, meeting the man's gaze head-on. "I was asked to provide my professional opinion on the circumstances of the plaintiff's termination. The facts of the case align with my expertise in identifying systemic patterns of bias." The attorney raised an eyebrow, feigning interest. "Systemic bias, you say? That's a bold claim, isn't it? Especially when you don't know the full history of the company or its leadership." "It's not a claim," Elijah said, his tone sharpening just enough to assert authority. "It's an analysis based on data, and documented behavior patterns don't lie." The attorney's lips twitched, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. "And yet, Your analysis is only as objective as the person conducting it, wouldn't you agree? Elijah felt the familiar prick of frustration, but kept his expression neutral. Objectivity comes from methodology, not opinion. My findings are supported by evidence. The attorney nodded, as though conceding the point, before shifting gears. Let's talk about evidence. Then you've made quite a name for yourself, Dr. Carter. Lectures, book tours, appearances on national television. Do you ever worry that being so high profile might color your judgment, perhaps even skew your interpretation of events? The question was a trap, and Elijah knew it. He took a measured breath before answering. My reputation is built on accuracy and integrity, not publicity. I don't allow outside perceptions to influence my work. The attorney's eyes narrowed, sensing he wouldn't get the reaction he was fishing for. He turned back to the jury, spreading his hands in a gesture of faux sincerity. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm not questioning Dr. Carter's accomplishments, but doesn't it seem odd that someone with his stature would involve himself in a small-town case like this? Makes you wonder what his real motivations are. Elijah's jaw tightened, but he kept his composure. He knew better than to take the bait, even as the insinuation hung in the air like a cloud of smoke. As the hearing adjourned for lunch, Elijah stepped outside into the courtyard. The crisp air, a welcome reprieve from the suffocating tension of the courtroom. He leaned against a stone bench, closing his eyes for a moment to gather himself. Dr. Carter, a voice called out. He opened his eyes to see Meredith approaching, her expression a mix of concern and determination. You handled that well, she said. But they're not done with you yet. They never are, Elijah replied, a wry smile tugging at his lips. Meredith hesitated, then added, You're holding up though, right? These kinds of tactics, they're designed to rattle you. Elijah nodded, though the weight in his chest felt heavier than he let on. I'm used to it, he said simply. But as they returned to the courthouse, Elijah couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. He could feel the system closing in around him, its mechanisms designed to protect those in power at any cost. And for the first time in a long while, he wondered if even his resilience would be enough. Elijah Carter's heartbeat thudded in his ears as he stepped back into the courtroom after lunch. The crisp air outside had done little to ease the simmering frustration from the morning. He glanced toward the defense table, where the opposing attorney was already conferring with his client. Their smug expressions were hard to miss. They believed they had rattled him, chipped away at his credibility. Meredith Daniels leaned over, her voice low but firm. Stay focused. They're throwing everything they can to derail you, but the jury is watching. They see through this. Elijah nodded, drawing a deep breath. He needed to maintain control, not just for himself, but for the case and the plaintiff whose career had been destroyed by corporate prejudice. This wasn't just about him, it never was. The judge entered, bringing the courtroom to order, and the defense wasted no time calling their next witness. The defendant himself, Mark Everett, the corporate manager accused of firing his black employee based on unfounded claims, took the stand with an air of confidence that bordered on arrogance. His tailored suit and well-rehearsed demeanor spoke of a man used to being in control, a man who never expected his actions to be scrutinized so closely. The defense attorney's questions were calculated, framing Everett as a diligent leader who only acted out of necessity. According to his testimony, the employee had been underperforming, creating a toxic environment for his colleagues. Everett spoke with a calm authority that belied the systemic discrimination Elijah had seen in the records. But it wasn't until Meredith began her cross-examination that cracks started to show. Mr. Everett, she began, her tone sharp but measured. You've stated that the termination was based on performance issues. Could you clarify what specific metrics or documentation supported your decision? Everett hesitated, his confidence wavering slightly. Well, there were several complaints from colleagues. Complaints which, as we've established, were anonymous and unverified, Meredith interrupted. Let's focus on performance metrics. Did this employee fail to meet specific quotas or deadlines? Everett shifted in his seat. No, but there were concerns about his attitude and his ability to work collaboratively. So no concrete evidence of underperformance? Meredith pressed. Everett's jaw tightened. It wasn't about numbers, it was about maintaining a healthy work environment. Meredith nodded, as if considering his response. Interesting. And yet, during the 6 years this employee worked under your supervision, he received consistent performance reviews, praising his teamwork and professionalism. Were those reviews inaccurate? Everett faltered, his composure slipping further. No, but circumstances changed. Circumstances like his decision to file a complaint about discriminatory practices within the company? Meredith's voice cut through the room like a blade. The jury stirred, their attention sharp. Everett's face reddened, and he stammered out a denial, but the damage was done. Meredith's line of questioning had planted seeds of doubt, forcing everyone to confront the possibility that the termination wasn't about performance at all. It was retaliation. As Meredith returned to their table, she shot Elijah a glance that spoke volumes. "We're getting to them," she murmured. Elijah nodded, but his focus shifted to the gallery. A small group of reporters had slipped into the back row, their pens and cameras at the ready. The case had begun to draw attention beyond the courtroom, a double-edged sword that could either amplify their cause or invite scrutiny of Elijah himself. The next witness was called, a senior HR executive from Everett's company. Her testimony was meant to reinforce the defense's narrative, but it quickly became apparent that she had little more than vague assertions and hearsay to offer. Meredith seized the opportunity to dismantle her credibility. "Ms. Whitaker," Meredith began, her tone laced with precision, "you've testified that the company's termination policies were followed in this case. Can you confirm whether those policies require written documentation of performance issues prior to termination?" The executive hesitated. "Yes, that is standard policy. And yet, no such documentation exists for this employee. How do you reconcile that discrepancy?" Whitaker's face paled, her carefully constructed answers unraveling under Meredith's relentless questioning. "There were extenuating circumstances." "Extenuating circumstances, or a lack of justification?" Meredith countered. The room seemed to hold its breath, as Whitaker faltered, unable to provide a satisfactory response. During a brief recess, Elijah stepped into the hallway for a moment of quiet. He wasn't alone for long. "Dr. Carter," a voice called out. He turned to see a man approaching, a reporter, judging by the notepad and recorder in hand. The man's demeanor was polite, but persistent. "Do you have a moment to comment on the case?" Elijah shook his head. "I'm sorry, but I can't discuss an ongoing trial." The reporter wasn't deterred. "Just one question. How do you respond to critics who say you're using this case to further your own agenda, that you're leveraging your position for personal gain?" The question landed like a blow, but Elijah kept his expression neutral. "My only agenda is justice," he said evenly. "If standing up for what's right is seen as self-serving, that says more about the critics than it does about me." Before the reporter could respond, a bailiff appeared, signaling that the trial was resuming. Elijah walked back into the courtroom, his mind buzzing with frustration. The reporter's words lingered, a stark reminder of how easily his motives could be misconstrued. As the afternoon wore on, the defense shifted tactics, focusing their attention squarely on Elijah during cross-examination. The opposing attorney rose with a stack of papers in hand, his expression smug. "Dr. Carter," he began, "you've positioned yourself as an expert on systemic bias. Can you tell us how many similar cases you've testified in?" "4," Elijah replied, "each involving documented patterns of discrimination." "And were those cases all successful?" the attorney pressed. Elijah's jaw tightened. 3 of the 4 resulted in favorable outcomes for the plaintiffs. The attorney pounced. "So one of your analyses was deemed insufficient. Doesn't that suggest your methods are flawed?" "It suggests that justice isn't always served, despite the evidence," Elijah shot back, his tone steady but firm. The attorney smirked, turning to the jury. "Interesting perspective. But tell me, Dr. Carter, how do you respond to allegations that your involvement in cases like this is less about justice and more about self-promotion?" Elijah felt a flicker of anger, but forced himself to remain composed. "I respond by pointing to the facts. My role here isn't about promotion, it's about accountability." The attorney leaned forward, his voice dripping with condescension. "And yet, your book sales seem to spike after every high-profile case. Coincidence?" The courtroom buzzed with murmurs, but Elijah didn't flinch. He met the attorney's gaze with unflinching resolve. If bringing attention to injustice leads people to seek out my work, I won't apologize for that. The truth deserves to be heard. The attorney's smile faltered, and he quickly moved on, but the damage was done. The line of questioning had sown doubt, and Elijah could feel the weight of it pressing down on him. By the end of the day, tensions in the courtroom were at a breaking point. Meredith turned to Elijah as they packed up their materials. "They're playing dirty, but they're desperate. Don't let them get to you." Elijah nodded, though the strain was evident in his posture. "They can question my motives all they want. The truth is still the truth." As they exited the courthouse, a small crowd had gathered outside, protesters holding signs, reporters shouting questions, and onlookers snapping photos. The atmosphere was chaotic, charged with both support and skepticism. One voice rose above the noise. "Dr. Carter, do you really think you can change anything, or are you just another figurehead?" Elijah stopped, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. He took a step forward, his voice carrying above the din. "Change doesn't come from standing on the sidelines. It comes from showing up, speaking out, and holding people accountable. That's what I'm here to do." The crowd quieted, his words hanging in the air. But as he turned to leave, he couldn't shake the feeling that the storm was far from over. The next morning, Elijah Carter stood in his modest hotel room, gazing out the window at the bustling city below. The sharp lines of skyscrapers loomed against the horizon, a stark reminder of the power structures he was up against. His reflection in the glass mirrored the tension in his mind. He had faced challenges like this before, but the stakes here were higher, the opposition more ruthless. Every word he had spoken in court, every piece of evidence presented, had been scrutinized and twisted. A knock on the door snapped him from his thoughts. Meredith Daniels entered, her face set in a mix of concern and determination. "We have a problem," she said, handing him a tablet. The screen displayed a news article with a bold headline: "Prominent civil rights expert accused of manipulating data in past case." Elijah's stomach dropped as he read the accusations, each one more damning than the last. The claims were baseless, but they were sensational enough to cast doubt on his credibility. "They're digging up anything they can find to discredit me," he said, his voice steady, but tinged with frustration. "This is their play." Meredith nodded. "It's classic character assassination. They can't refute the evidence, so they're going after you." Elijah placed the tablet on the desk and exhaled deeply. "Then we double down. They want to play dirty, let's show them what integrity looks like." The courtroom was packed by the time they arrived. Word of the article had spread, and the air buzzed with tension. Reporters lined the back, their cameras poised to capture every moment. Elijah noticed a few familiar faces in the crowd: community leaders, activists, and even former clients who had come to show their support. As the proceedings began, the defense team wasted no time leveraging the article. The opposing attorney, a sharp-faced man named Bradley Mills, rose with an air of self-satisfaction. "Your Honor," Mills began, "we would like to present new evidence that calls into question Dr. Carter's credibility as an expert witness." Meredith immediately objected, her voice firm. "Your Honor, this so-called evidence is nothing more than a smear campaign designed to distract from the facts of this case." The judge frowned, clearly displeased with the disruption. "I'll allow a brief discussion. Proceed carefully, Mr. Mills." Mills smirked as he approached the jury, holding up a printed copy of the article. "Ladies and gentlemen, this isn't just about the facts of this case, it's about the credibility of those presenting them. If Dr. Carter has been accused of fabricating data before, how can we trust his testimony now?" Elijah clenched his fists under the table, but kept his expression neutral. Meredith shot him a glance, her eyes flashing with a silent message: "Stay calm." When her turn came, Meredith dismantled the defense's argument with precision. "This article is based on unfounded allegations from a disgruntled party in an unrelated case. It holds no relevance to the evidence presented here. The defense is grasping at straws because they know their position is weak." Her rebuttal was met with murmurs of approval from the gallery, but the damage was done. The seeds of doubt had been planted. During the lunch break, Elijah and Meredith met with Mitchell, one of Elijah's closest allies and a key strategist in their fight. Mitchell's usually calm demeanor was visibly shaken. "This is getting out of hand," he said, pacing the small conference room. They're not just coming for you, they're trying to bury everything you've worked for. Elijah leaned against the table, his jaw tight. I expected resistance, but not this level of personal attack. We need to hit back, Mitchell urged. Expose their tactics. Show the world what's really happening behind the scenes. Meredith shook her head. That could backfire. If we come across as defensive, it'll only fuel their narrative. Elijah raised a hand to stop the argument. Enough, we stick to the facts. The truth is our strongest weapon. Mitchell hesitated, but nodded reluctantly. All right, but we need to be prepared. They're not going to stop. As they left the room, Elijah's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. They're hiding something. Check the internal memos from January Anonymous. Elijah showed the message to Meredith, who frowned. Could be a trap? Or it could be exactly what we need, Elijah countered. That evening, Elijah sat in front of his laptop, combing through public records and corporate documents. His eyes burned from hours of searching. But he refused to stop. If there was any truth to the anonymous tip, it could be the key to turning the case in their favor. Finally, he found it. A series of emails buried in a corporate filing. The language was subtle but damning. Discussions of streamlining diversity and minimizing the impact of grievances. One email even referenced the plaintiff by name, suggesting ways to restructure the team to avoid future complaints. Elijah forwarded the files to Meredith with a single line. We've got them. The next day in court, Meredith presented the emails as new evidence. The defense team scrambled, their confident facade cracking under the weight of the revelations. Mills tried to object, but the judge overruled him, allowing the emails to be entered into evidence. As the jury read the documents, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. The defense's narrative was crumbling, and Elijah could see it in their faces, but the fight wasn't over yet. Outside the courthouse, the crowd had grown. Supporters held signs demanding justice, while detractors shouted accusations. Elijah stood on the steps, addressing the media with measured calm. This case isn't just about one man's experience, he said, his voice carrying over the noise. It's about a system that allows prejudice to thrive. We're not just seeking justice for one, we're fighting for accountability for all. As he turned to leave, a man stepped forward from the crowd, a former employee of the defendant's company. His face was pale, his hands shaking as he approached Elijah. I need to talk to you, the man said, his voice barely above a whisper. There's more you don't know. Elijah's eyes narrowed. What do you mean? The man glanced around nervously before leaning closer. They've been covering up complaints for years. There's a file, but it's locked away. Elijah exchanged a look with Meredith, who had joined his side. Where is it? The man hesitated, then whispered, the main office, 3rd floor. But you'll need someone on the inside to get it. The weight of his words settled over them. If what the man said was true, it could blow the case wide open, or put Elijah and his team in even greater danger. Meredith touched his arm. What do we do? Elijah's jaw set, determination hardening his features. We find that file, whatever it takes. The grand atrium of the corporate headquarters buzzed with the low hum of business. As usual, employees in sharp suits moved with practiced urgency, heads down, unaware of the storm brewing just outside. Elijah Carter stood in the shadow of the gleaming glass building, his breath steady, his resolve firm. Beside him, Meredith Daniels adjusted her bag, her face unreadable, but her eyes sharp. Behind them, Mitchell paced, his phone clutched tightly in his hand. They're not going to let us in without a fight, Mitchell murmured. You sure about this? Elijah's lips pressed into a thin line. If we back down now, we'll lose the only leverage we have. They've been hiding behind their power for too long. Meredith nodded, her voice low but resolute. We have the files. If we confront them directly, they won't have time to spin this. Elijah's phone buzzed. A single message from the anonymous tipster. 3rd floor, East Wing, conference room. B. They're expecting you. He slipped the phone back into his pocket and adjusted his blazer. Let's go. Inside the building, the sterile decor and polished marble floors seemed to amplify the tension. Security guards eyed the trio as they approached the reception desk. We're here to see Nathaniel Graves, Elijah announced, his voice calm but firm. Graves was the CEO, the man who had presided over years of systemic bias and cover-ups. Elijah knew he was walking straight into the lion's den, but it was the only way. The receptionist hesitated, her fingers hovering over her keyboard. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," Elijah replied, "but he'll want to see us. Tell him it's about the emails." Her face paled, and her eyes flickered to the guards. Without another word, she picked up the phone and murmured into the receiver. Moments later, one of the guards approached. "Follow me," he said curtly. The group was led to an elevator, their reflections distorted in the polished metal walls as they ascended. When the doors opened, they were greeted by an assistant who ushered them into a sprawling conference room, with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city. Nathaniel Graves stood at the far end of the room, his silhouette framed by the skyline. "Dr. Carter," Graves greeted, his tone clipped but controlled. "This is an unexpected visit." Elijah stepped forward, placing a folder on the conference table. "Not as unexpected as this." Graves's brow furrowed as he opened the folder. His expression darkened as he flipped through the pages, emails, memos, and internal documents that painted a damning picture of discriminatory practices and deliberate cover-ups. "This," Elijah said, his voice rising, "is a record of your company's systemic bias emails where your executives discussed streamlining diversity, a euphemism for ignoring complaints memos about restructuring departments to silence whistleblowers, and complaints filed against employees that were conveniently swept under the rug." Graves closed the folder with a snap, his jaw tightening. "Where did you get this?" Elijah crossed his arms. "That doesn't matter. What matters is what happens next." Graves's calm facade began to crack. "You're making accusations based on stolen documents and hearsay that won't hold up in court." "It's not just documents," Meredith interjected, stepping forward. "We have witnesses, people from your own company, who are willing to testify about the toxic culture you fostered here." Graves's eyes darted to the door, as though calculating his escape. "This is a smear campaign. You're trying to destroy a company that employs thousands of people. Do you really think anyone will side with you?" Elijah leaned forward, his voice cold and precise. "This isn't about destroying your company. It's about exposing the truth. You've built your success on the backs of marginalized employees, using their silence as your shield that ends today." Graves's lips curled into a sneer. "You're a fool if you think you can take me down. I've been doing this for decades. People like you come and go, shouting about justice while the system stays the same." "People like me?" Elijah repeated, his voice dangerously calm. "You mean black men who challenge the status quo, men who don't fit into the box you've decided they belong in?" Graves said nothing, but his silence was answer enough. The tension was shattered by a sharp knock at the door. Before Graves could respond, the door opened, and a man entered. Richard, one of the company's senior executives. He froze when he saw Elijah and Meredith. "What's going on here?" Richard asked, his voice uneasy. Elijah turned to him. "We're here to talk about accountability, something your company seems to have forgotten." Richard glanced at Graves, who gave him a subtle shake of the head. But Richard hesitated, his gaze lingering on the folder in Graves's hand. "Richard," Elijah said, his tone measured, "how much longer are you going to stand by while this company destroys lives? You know what's in those files, you've seen it firsthand." Richard's face tightened. He looked at Graves, then back at Elijah. I can't be a part of this anymore." "What are you doing?" Graves demanded, his voice sharp. Richard stepped forward, his shoulders squaring. "I'm doing what's right. If this comes out in court, it's going to destroy us. But if we come clean now, acknowledge what we've done, and commit to real change, we might stand a chance." Graves' face twisted with rage. "You're betraying the company." "No," Richard said firmly. "I'm holding us accountable." Elijah saw the opening and seized it. "Graves, this is your last chance. We're prepared to take this to court, to the media, to anyone who will listen. But if you admit to what's in these files, if you agree to reparations and systemic reforms, we can resolve this without tearing everything apart." Graves stared at him, his jaw clenched. For a moment, it seemed like he might agree, but then his expression hardened. "You think you've won," he said, his voice low and venomous, "but you have no idea what you're up against. The media, the courts, they're all on my side. You'll be crushed before this even begins." Meredith stepped forward, her voice sharp. "You're underestimating us again. Just like you've underestimated everyone who's ever stood up to you." Elijah held Graves's gaze. "The choice is yours: do the right thing, or watch everything you've built come crashing down." For a moment, the room was silent, the air thick with tension. Then Graves picked up the folder, his knuckles white against the paper. "I need time to consider," he said finally. Elijah's jaw tightened. "You have 24 hours after that. The world will see these files." As the group left the conference room, the weight of the confrontation settled over them. They had struck a blow, but the battle was far from over. Outside, Elijah's phone buzzed again. Another message from the anonymous tipster. "Be ready, there's more coming." Elijah looked at Meredith and Mitchell, his expression resolute. "This isn't over. Not by a long shot." The air in the room felt heavy, as though every particle carried the weight of the confrontation to come. Elijah Carter stood in the dimly lit office, his eyes locked onto Officer Daniels, who leaned casually against the desk, as if this were just another routine intimidation tactic. But tonight was different, and Elijah was determined to make sure Daniels knew it. The room was stark, the walls bare except for the seal of the department hanging crookedly behind Daniels. The faint hum of fluorescent lights buzzed above them, a cold and sterile backdrop to the tension that crackled between the two men. Meredith, Daniels, and Mitchell stood behind Elijah, their presence both a reassurance and a reminder of how far they'd come to get to this moment. "You've been poking your nose where it doesn't belong, Carter," Officer Daniels said, his tone dripping with condescension. "You really think you're going to take me down? Do you have any idea who I am?" Elijah's lips curled into a tight smile, his voice steady and measured. "Oh, I know exactly who you are, Daniels. And I'm not here to play by your rules." Daniels laughed, a hollow, mocking sound. "You've got some nerve coming in here, thinking you're going to change anything. This city is mine, you're just another loudmouth trying to make noise." Elijah took a step closer, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, though his voice remained calm. "The thing about noise, Daniels, is that it gets attention, and we've got plenty of it now." He reached into his bag and pulled out a stack of papers, slapping them onto the desk between them. Daniels glanced down, his confident smirk faltering for the briefest moment. The documents detailed years of misconduct, abuses of power, and internal memos from the department that Daniels had tried so hard to bury. At the top of the pile was a signed affidavit from another officer, someone who had finally decided to speak out. "You want to know who you are?" Elijah continued, his voice rising. "You're a bully with a badge. A man who's been protected by a system that's just as broken and corrupt as you are, but that ends today." Daniel's expression hardened, his jaw tightening as he shoved the papers aside. "This won't stick. You think some disgruntled officers and a few pieces of paper are enough to take me down? Good luck with that." Elijah leaned forward, his voice dropping to a dangerous calm. "You're right, the system is rigged to protect people like you. But we've got more than paper. We've got people, witnesses, videos, testimonies from those you thought were too scared to fight back, and it's all going public." Daniel's hand twitched toward his belt, a subtle but unmistakable threat. "You don't know what you're messing with, Carter. Walk away now, and I might let you leave in one piece." Meredith stepped forward, her voice cutting through the room like steel. "You mean like you let those others walk away, Daniels? The ones who filed complaints that mysteriously disappeared, the ones you threatened and silenced, we know all about them." Daniel's eyes flicked to her, his mask of composure slipping further. "You don't know anything." "Don't we?" she shot back, pulling out her phone and tapping the screen. A video began to play, the grainy footage showing Daniels in a heated exchange with another officer in the precinct parking lot. His voice was clear as day. "I don't care what you have to do. Make it disappear. No one's going to believe them anyway." Daniels's face went pale, his swagger replaced with a simmering fury. "You think that's enough to bring me down? It's just one video. Who's going to trust the word of a bunch of nobodies over mine?" Elijah's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "That's your problem, Daniels. You've spent your whole career underestimating people, but those nobodies are standing up now, and they're not alone." Daniels pushed off the desk, stepping closer to Elijah, his posture towering and aggressive. "You really think you're a hero, don't you? You think you're going to save the world?" Elijah didn't flinch. "I'm not trying to save the world, just trying to hold people like you accountable." "That's a start." Daniel's face twisted into a sneer, his bravado cracking. "You're nothing, you don't have the power to do anything." Elijah's eyes narrowed. "You're right, I don't have your kind of power, but I've got something stronger. The truth. And people are listening." Daniels lunged forward, his hand grabbing Elijah's lapel. Mitchell stepped forward instinctively, but Elijah held up a hand to stop him. "You've been hiding behind that badge for years," Elijah said, his voice calm even as Daniel's grip tightened. "But now, everyone's going to see you for what you really are." Daniels shoved him back, his face contorted with rage. "You don't get it, do you? I'm untouchable." The door behind them opened suddenly, and several figures entered the room. Officers in uniform, led by Captain Rivera, the precinct's commanding officer. Her face was unreadable as she took in the scene. Elijah standing firm, Daniels seething with barely restrained anger, and the damning documents spread across the desk. "What's going on here?" Rivera demanded, her voice sharp. Daniels straightened, his composure returning as he turned to her. "Captain, these people are trespassing. They're trying to undermine this department with baseless accusations." Rivera's gaze shifted to Elijah, then to the papers on the desk. She picked up the stack, her expression darkening as she scanned the contents. "These aren't baseless," she said coldly. "We've been investigating you, Daniels, and this," she held up the affidavit, "is just the tip of the iceberg." Daniels' face went slack, his confidence shattering. "You can't be serious. You're going to take their word over mine?" Rivera's eyes hardened. "This isn't just their word. It's the evidence we've been collecting for months. You thought you were untouchable, Daniels, but your time is up." As two officers stepped forward to place Daniels under arrest, he exploded with anger, shoving them aside and pointing a finger at Elijah. "You did this, you think you've won, but this isn't over." Elijah stood tall, his voice steady. "No, Daniels, it's just the beginning." The officers subdued Daniels and led him out of the room, his shouts echoing down the hallway. Captain Rivera turned to Elijah, her expression softening slightly. "You've done a lot of good today," she said. "But this fight isn't over. The system doesn't change overnight." Elijah nodded, the weight of her words sinking in. "I know, but it's a start." Rivera extended a hand, a silent acknowledgement of the battle they'd fought together. Elijah shook it, a sense of cautious hope settling over him. As he turned to leave with Meredith and Mitchell, his phone buzzed again. A message from one of the whistleblowers they'd been working with. "The news is breaking. People are talking." Elijah looked at his friends, a faint smile breaking through the tension. "It's out there now, let's see what happens next." The uncertainty loomed, but so did the promise of change. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, it felt winnable. The morning air carried a hushed anticipation as Elijah stepped out of his apartment. The weight of the confrontation from the night before still lingered, but the sunlight felt different, softer, warmer, as though it too recognized the significance of what had transpired. His phone buzzed incessantly, a mix of reporters seeking interviews and messages of support flooding his inbox. For a moment, he stood still, taking in the reality of the new day. The news was already breaking, headlines flashed across screens. "Corrupt officer arrested after whistleblower and activist take a stand." Images of Daniels being led away in handcuffs circulated online, accompanied by grainy footage of Elijah's speech to the gathered officers. The court of public opinion had begun its deliberation, and for once, Elijah felt the tide might be turning in the right direction. Later that afternoon, Elijah met with Meredith and Mitchell at a local community center that had become their de facto headquarters during the fight against systemic corruption. The room buzzed with energy as volunteers worked to sort through documents and plan their next moves. Mitchell sat at a desk with a laptop, scrolling through news updates while Meredith handed out coffee cups, her movements brisk and purposeful. "They're calling it a seismic shift," Mitchell said, spinning his screen toward Elijah. The article detailed how Daniels' arrest had triggered an internal investigation into the precinct. Multiple officers were already implicated, and the department had announced plans to audit years' worth of complaints. "It's just the beginning," Meredith said, though her smile betrayed her pride. "We both know the system is going to fight back hard. But for now, we have momentum." Elijah nodded, his fingers tightening around his coffee cup. He had wanted this victory, fought for it. But now that it was here, he couldn't shake the mix of emotions swirling inside him. Relief, yes, but also anger for all the people who hadn't had the chance to stand up, who had been silenced before their voices could be heard. "They're going to try to spin this," Elijah said, his voice steady, but tinged with caution. "Daniels is just one man. They'll pin everything on him and act like the problem's solved." "Which is why we can't stop now," Meredith replied firmly. "This isn't just about him, it's about everything he represents." As the days unfolded, Elijah found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. He thought about the nights spent in quiet frustration, the moments when he doubted whether any of this would matter. Standing up to Daniels had taken more than courage. It had demanded resilience, patience, and a willingness to risk everything. He realized that the ordeal had changed him in ways he hadn't anticipated. There was a newfound clarity in his purpose, a deeper understanding of the systemic barriers that had shaped not only his life, but the lives of countless others. He saw now that his fight was part of something much larger, a battle that required not just individual acts of defiance, but collective action. The anger that had once felt all-consuming had transformed into something sharper, more focused. It wasn't just about pushing back against injustice, it was about building something better. In the weeks that followed, the fallout from Daniels' arrest sent shockwaves through the community. Activist groups rallied around Elijah's story, using it as a rallying cry to demand broader reform. City council meetings were flooded with citizens demanding accountability, and petitions for independent oversight of the police force garnered thousands of signatures. At the precinct, the ripple effects were undeniable. Several officers who had long protected Daniels were placed on administrative leave pending investigation. Whistleblowers began to come forward, emboldened by Elijah's stand. Each new revelation painted a clearer picture of a culture that had enabled corruption to thrive unchecked. The local media shifted its tone, moving beyond the spectacle of Daniels' downfall to examine the deeper issues at play. Panel discussions featured activists, legal experts, and community leaders debating the need for systemic change. Elijah found himself at the center of the conversation, invited to speak at town halls and press conferences. One evening, as he addressed a packed auditorium, he felt the weight of the moment settle over him. "This isn't about one bad officer," he told the crowd, his voice steady but impassioned. "This is about a system that allowed him to operate with impunity. If we want real change, we have to hold the entire system accountable, and that starts with us." The room erupted in applause, the energy palpable. For the first time, Elijah felt not just the burden of responsibility, but the power of collective action. He wasn't alone in this fight, and that made all the difference. Amid the whirlwind of public appearances and strategic planning, Elijah found moments of quiet reflection. One evening, he visited the small park where he'd often gone to clear his head during the height of the conflict. The air was cool, the sound of rustling leaves mingling with distant laughter from a nearby playground. He sat on a bench, staring at the horizon as the sun dipped below the skyline. His mind drifted to the people who had stood by him. Meredith, who had never wavered in her support. Mitchell, whose quiet determination had kept them grounded. And even Captain Rivera, who had taken a risk by stepping in at the right moment. Most of all, he thought about the community that had rallied around him. The faces of strangers who had sent messages of encouragement. The volunteers who had worked tirelessly behind the scenes. They were the true heroes of this story. Elijah pulled out his phone and opened the latest message from one of the families affected by Daniels' actions. It was a photo of a young boy holding a sign that read, "Thank you for fighting for us." Tears pricked at the corners of his eyes, and he allowed himself a rare moment of vulnerability. The fight wasn't over. But for now, he could take solace in the fact that it had made a difference. As Elijah prepared to leave the park, his phone buzzed with a call from Meredith. "We've got another meeting tomorrow," she said. "This one's with a coalition of community leaders. They want to hear our ideas for police oversight." "Count me in," Elijah replied, a faint smile playing at his lips. He had learned to take things one step at a time, to measure progress not in sweeping victories, but in the smaller, quieter moments that paved the way for change. The road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but he was ready to face it. As he walked home, the city around him seemed to hum with new energy. The fight for justice was far from over, but for the first time, Elijah felt a sense of hope, a belief that the system could be changed, that voices like his could no longer be ignored. Elijah Jackson sat at the edge of the community center's rooftop garden, a quiet sanctuary, where the hum of the city below seemed distant, almost unreal. The journey that had led him here felt both like a lifetime ago and like it had only just begun. As he gazed at the horizon, the events of the past weeks played out in his mind with vivid clarity, each moment a marker of how far he had come. Not just as an individual, but as a symbol of a broader fight. The man who had walked into that small boutique weeks ago had been confident in his success, but accustomed to the quiet indignities that came with it. The microaggressions, the sidelong glances, and the moments of condescension. All of it had felt like an unspoken tax on his accomplishments. But that day had been different. The blatant prejudice and power play by Daniels had been the breaking point. A visceral reminder of the systemic racism that too often went unchallenged. Elijah had faced the storm head-on, not just for himself, but for everyone who had been silenced by similar acts of injustice. In doing so, he had rediscovered a part of himself he hadn't realized was missing, the part that could channel anger into purpose, fear into action, and frustration into change. Reflecting on the events, Elijah recognized how his personal ordeal had illuminated the broader societal issues that had long plagued communities like his. Daniel's actions weren't isolated. They were part of a pattern, one that thrived in silence and complacency. The confrontation had forced that pattern into the light, exposing not only Daniel's, but also the systems that had enabled him. Elijah's journey had shown him the importance of persistence in the face of adversity. It wasn't just about speaking out, it was about holding people accountable, building coalitions, and creating pathways for systemic change. The ripple effects of his actions had already begun to take shape. Daniel's arrest had sparked an investigation into the precinct, and for the first time, long-buried complaints were being taken seriously. The public scrutiny had also galvanized community leaders, activists, and citizens to demand better from their leaders. It wasn't a complete victory, Elijah knew that, but it was progress. And progress, he realized, wasn't always about immediate wins. Sometimes, it was about planting seeds and nurturing them over time. The experience had transformed Elijah in ways he hadn't anticipated. For years, he had focused solely on his personal success, believing that achieving his goals would insulate him from the prejudice that had shadowed his life. But the events with Daniels had shattered that illusion. Success, he realized, didn't make him immune to systemic bias. It simply put him in a position to challenge it more effectively. Through the ordeal, Elijah had developed a resilience that went beyond enduring injustice. It was a resilience rooted in action, in standing firm even when the odds seemed insurmountable. He had learned to navigate the fine line between anger and composure, understanding that strength wasn't about suppressing emotions, but channeling them into something meaningful. Elijah also came to appreciate the power of community. While he had initiated the fight against Daniels, he hadn't fought alone. Meredith's fiery determination, Mitchell's quiet support, and the collective efforts of the community had all been instrumental. Their faith in him, and in the cause, had given him the courage to keep going, even when doubt threatened to overtake him. The case against Daniels had become more than a legal battle. It had ignited a movement across the city. Conversations about systemic racism, abuse of power, and accountability were taking center stage. Local news outlets hosted debates, activists organized marches, and citizens began to question long-standing practices within law enforcement. Elijah saw how his story had resonated with people from all walks of life. It wasn't just about one man's experience, it was about a shared struggle for dignity and equality. His willingness to stand up had given others the courage to do the same, creating a ripple effect that extended far beyond the city. The most significant impact, however, was the sense of possibility that began to take root. For so long, systemic issues had felt insurmountable, the status quo too deeply entrenched to change, but Elijah's stand proved that change was possible, that when individuals came together and demanded accountability, Even the most rigid systems could be challenged. Elijah knew that his journey wasn't unique across the country. Countless people face similar struggles, their voices often drowned out by indifference or hostility. But his story was a reminder that no one was truly powerless. Standing up to injustice wasn't easy, and it often came at a cost, but it was necessary. To those watching, Elijah's message was clear. Progress required resilience, courage, and the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. It was about finding strength in the face of adversity and refusing to accept silence as the answer. "We have the power to demand better," he said during a televised interview, his voice steady and resolute. "But it starts with each of us. It starts with speaking out, supporting one another, and holding those in power accountable. Change isn't just possible, it's inevitable if we're willing to fight for it." As Elijah rose from the rooftop garden and began his descent back into the heart of the city, he felt a profound sense of closure, not because the fight was over, but because he was ready for what came next. He had been tested, and he had emerged stronger, more focused, and more determined than ever. Walking through the bustling streets, he noticed the small but significant signs of change. A community board advertising a forum on police accountability, a mural celebrating local activists, and the conversations of passers-by grappling with issues that had once been ignored. The city was beginning to wake up, and Elijah felt a quiet pride in knowing he had played a part in that. As he rounded the corner to the community center, he saw a group of young people gathered, their energy infectious, as they planned the next steps in their advocacy work. One of them looked up and called out to him, "Elijah, you're coming to the meeting, right?" He smiled, nodding. "Wouldn't miss it." Elijah knew that the road ahead would be long and filled with challenges, but for the first time, he felt certain that the fight was worth it, not just for him, but for everyone who had been told they didn't matter. The journey had shown him the power of resilience, the importance of community, and the need for systemic change. And as he stepped into the community center, he carried with him the unshakable belief that progress wasn't just a possibility, it was a promise waiting to be fulfilled. The fight wasn't over, but neither was he together. They would keep pushing forward, one step at a time, until justice was more than just a word, it was a reality.